In building this clock, I'm going to show you how to cut hand-cut dovetails, rabbet joints, lap joints, veneering, metal leafing, and how to deal with some pretty bowed lumber. Hi, welcome to the shop. Been working around the shop a lot lately, and I want to build something for the house. We remodeled the dining room kitchen area this past summer, and one wall is blank, and we decided we needed a clock there. So I'm going to build one out of white oak. And I know I'm a traditionalist and I like mechanical movement, but I also know the reality is I'm not very good at keeping it wound. So I decided we'd see what I could find. I found this at Clock Kit. It's a website, been around for a long time. What I found was a battery powered movement that's got a pendulum and a mechanical chime. So I think that's going to fit the bill. Just got it in, so let's see what we've got and we'll go from there. All right, looks like it's well packaged. Here's the pendulum. And I'm going to do something a little bit different with this pendulum, so we'll get to that in a bit. These are the hands. Now when you order the clock, you're able to pick whatever hands you want. These hands fit the style that I'm looking for. And here's a little envelope with the washers and nuts that you need for the hands. And then here's the movement. All right, looks like a typical battery powered movement, but it's a lot bigger. On the back side, you can see a place for the battery, and here are the little chime movements. Sounds about right. I think this will do pretty well. Before I get started, I wanted to make sure I had this in hand so I could get the measurements off of it and make sure that the clock I build is going to fit.
Once I finalized the design and created a cut list, I jointed, sawed, planed, and resawed the sides of the cabinet.
Now let's look at the board itself. I had one piece of white oak lumber that was 5/4 inch thick and I don't know, about 4 feet long, something like that. This is the way it was laid out. So here's how I cut it out first of all. First, I ripped out this for the sides. Then I ripped 1/2 inch pieces that when turned sideways will now be the front of the door. This is giving me some flecking in here from the quarter saw nature of that. So I've got these boards to do that. Then this is waste, and you can see by the angle of how that is that there was a bit of a crook in this board, which I'll show you in a minute here that came to haunt me. Then this piece was resawn to the thickness for the door, and this will be the middle. I'm going to put an arc in this, and that's going to be the center of the door. Now, here's where I ran into troubles. I resawed this piece, and as it happens sometimes when you're resawing lumber, it began to bow. So, how do you deal with that? My plan is to take the boards, turn them this way so the cup is towards the inside, and then when I make the two sides this way, I'm going to, at the bottom of the face, I'm going to put a board across the front to help push it out, keep it nice and straight. And I think that'll work out just fine.
Now we get the sides and the ends cut to length.
Hi, I really hope you're enjoying this video. If you are, please hit the like. I'd also like to know what projects you're working on this fall. Leave that in the comments and don't forget to subscribe.
Now to accept the back of the clock case, I'm cutting a rabbet all the way through on the top and bottom, and on the sides I'm going to stop just short of the bottom so that that rabbet won't show. To make sure it's good and square, I'm going to use the shooting board. I cut a little bit off the back end of that so I don't get any blowout, and I'll just trim that up. Now let's get started cutting the dovetails on the bottom of the case.
So the first thing I want to do is mark out the dovetails. So I want the size to stick through just about 1/16 of an inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark this with the thickness of the board plus a 1/16 inch spacer block. Now I can mark this all the way around. Now, for those, I'm going to use my other gauge. And these, I will just mark the front and back.
Now, while I lay out these pins, I'd like to just start off by saying there are a lot of great craftsmen on YouTube showing you how to cut dovetails. I'm not one of them. They'll tell you they've been cutting dovetails for 30 years. They've cut thousands of them. If you're like me, I'm never going to get to that point. I have to struggle with my dovetails, but I think if you stick around, you'll see that these are going to be totally acceptable joints and it'll look just fine. Now I'm using a couple calipers here to measure out the width of the pins. And about now is when I'm realizing I've done it backwards. Now you see there to the left of me, or to my right, there is, there you go. There's my sample that I cut before I started. And I'm using that to kind of measure things off and make sure I'm cutting them the way I wanted it to. Try it on your next dovetails. For me, it was a good reference and it was also kind of a confidence builder. Now using the dovetail guides like that, I mean, you're drawing them up fairly simple. So here I'm going to cut the tails, but I'm not cutting them all the way out. I'm going to use Rob Cosman's method, and it's a pretty effective way of doing it. So now we're going to mark the tail boards. So I'm putting in the tailboard in the vise, and I'm leveling it up with this 1, 2, 3 block. And that's going to be used to support the tailboard while I mark the pins. Now I'm putting some masking tape on. I'm going to cut this, and this is going to make the little ledge for that to slide up against when I mark the tailboards. It'll make sense here in just a second. The tape now acts as a small wall to push right up against the pin board. Now here's the secret to Rob Cosman's method. It's this thing he calls the Sean shim, and it's basically an offset that's just the thickness of the saw blade. Now that marking knife is also made with a saw blade that's exactly the same as the dovetail saw. Now by just laying it down in those cuts that we made for the tails, we can transfer that over to the pin board, and the offset brings it over so that the cut line is going to be on the outside of the pins. The kerf is there. Now all you have to do is lay the saw into that kerf and make the cuts. I'm bringing the lines down square, and we're just going to cut through those. First cut off the half tail, and now we're going to cut the waist out with a small fret saw. And then we begin chopping out the remainder of that. Chop it down about halfway, working way up to that score line. And again, doing it from each side down about halfway prevents you from blowing out the other side. If you want a good video, go to Rob Cosman's channel and watch his video on how to cut these dovetails. He's a lot better at it and will give you a lot more details. Now, they all can fit them right off the bat, but mine doesn't do that. So I'm going to have to trim a little bit more. And now, God forbid, I'm going to use a little bit of sandpaper to take a little bit more off. Now I've got the sandpaper wrapped around a hotel card as a small, thin sanding block, and just taking a little bit off the pins there. So now turning our attention to the top of the case, I'm cutting rabbets in the top to accept the sides rather than dovetails because they're going to be hidden by the brackets. Now I'm going to give it a quick final sand with some 220 before we assemble this. Now the assembly, putting glue on all the many surfaces of the dovetails. And put some glue on that rabbet. And you can see I had that bow still to deal with. So I'm going to use some spreader clamps to put some just temporary wedges in there. Keep that board straight. Now we'll get this out of the clamps and we'll move on to the veneering. So for the back, we're going to use some quarter sawn white oak veneer I found. Now it's sequential, so I'm going to be able to book match that. And then I'll have to cut a couple little strips to get the full width that I need. Now here I'm going to tape this together temporarily from the back side. Making sure I got it book matched the way I wanted it. Now we'll take that and we'll put some veneer tape on it. Now this is an old-fashioned stamp wetter thing from an antique store, and it just has some water in it, and I'm just wetting that veneer tape and I'm putting that on the front. Then once everything's been taped from the front, I take the tape off the back. Now let's get this glued down. I'm using Tight Bond cold pressed veneer glue and my custom made plastic spreader out of a hotel card. Put it in the veneer press, put the top platen on it and some of that mesh to allow the air to press around, and we'll get that pressed down. After about an hour and a half, we'll take it out of the press, clean off that veneer tape, and get it trimmed up to size. Now I've got to clean up that rabbet where I didn't go all the way through, so it's nice and square. And I'll start laying out the door. Taking that middle piece and marking where I want the arc to stop, and using one of these little bow contraptions to mark the arc. Cut it out on the bandsaw, sand it on the top of that belt sander, and that's my middle piece.
All right, so we're gonna lay this out. First thing I wanna do is make sure the grain is oriented in the right. These long stiles have more fleck and grain at the top than it does at the bottom. So I'm gonna put those both at the very top. And then this one has a little more grain pattern to it. So I'm gonna keep those up closer to the face. And then this one will go across there with that. Now what I'll do is I'm gonna line these up to the end with a square, and then I'll use my marking knife to mark out that dado on this side. Okay, so what I want to do here, this is the face of the clock cut out. Now with the door, there's going to be the frame itself, so I need to allow for that and see what the distance showing is. And then if I line that up, I want it to come down 10 7/8. So now if I measure from the top of that cabinet to the top of this middle rail, and it's going to be exactly 12 inches down. So that's where I'll set this cross rail.
I'm starting these joints by hogging out the majority of the joint with the dado head. I'm going less than halfway through so I can use my hand tools to sneak up onto the perfect fit. You can see here that I've got a little ways to go to get these perfectly flush. I'm using some sandpaper on a block to get the edges, and my favorite tool, the router plane. So you kind of come in from the edge, cutting off those, and then adjusting it down a little bit. Again, coming in from each side. That helps eliminate any tear out. And this way I'll just sneak up to that final fit. And now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Again, sanding it down a little bit and get a perfect fit. Now, once they're all trimmed to fit, we'll get this glued up. Then once the glue's dried and we get it out of the clamps, we'll get this sanded up and cleaned up all the edges, and we'll move on to the next step.
So, what I want to do is this is the top of the clock. It's going to extend it a little bit farther out. So, what I didn't want is these end grains showing. So I've got a full piece there. I'm now going to take, and on the front edge, I'm going to cut back or mark a 45 back from each of the corners. And then this piece will be cut to go in there. So now, and then when I cut this part out, and I trim this with a 45, I will be able to sit that in there, and then I'll have face frame. Then I can trim it up.
Once I got that cut out with the bandsaw, then I was able to clean up that corner with a chisel, and then any fuzz and rough spots with some sandpaper. Then we'll be able to take this end piece and fit it into place. Now I'm going to attach it with some of these wooden nails, pre-drill them, put a little glue on it, drive it in, cut them off, clean them up, and she's good. Now I'm going to cut the steep bevel on the top of the clock, clean it up with the plane.
Now at the top of the clock, we'll have this wide top, and then on each side, I'm going to use these little brackets that I've made. I basically took a piece of lumber about 2 inches long, and I just cut a small arc into it. I'm going to replicate that on 3 more, and those will be here as a little bracket on the side.
Now let's look at the clock face. I first drew it up in Adobe Illustrator and then created an SVG file that I could import into my laser, and then I did an engraving into a piece of plywood. Now I'm using a little alcohol to get any of the burn marks off, and then I'm going to finish it off with a number of coats of shellac. Now back to those brackets, we're going to also use those wooden nails to attach these, somewhat for looks, somewhat for strength. Now I'm going to get the top fitted on. Now the brackets need a little bit of trimming down to make sure it touched flush with the top. Get that glued on. And because that top was bowed, I'm also going to put a couple screws down through the top just to kind of hold that bow in place. Keeping with the arts and crafts feel, I was going to copper leaf the pendulum and I use some size to put on there first, let that dry till it's clear, and then you can just lay the copper on. Now, copper leaf, this metal leaf, is a whole lot easier than gold leaf because it's a little bit thicker. And now I'm using some cotton to rub it in. This actually had some plastic with it that I kind of used to help move it over there. Just knock off the loose parts and you're finished. Now it's off to staining. Now I have a 3-step process for staining. First, I'm starting off with some Mohawk Perfect Brown dye stain, and I'll put this over the whole thing, rubbing off the excess here once I get it all applied. Now the second step, I'm using a pigment stain. This is Rich Tobacco, also by Mohawk, and I'll put this on, I'll rub it out, and then I'll use the stain reducer on a rag to kind of pull some of that stain off until I get it just the right color that I wanted. I was going for a like a fumigated oak look, and I think I got pretty close. Now, once the stain is dried, I can begin putting on the clear coat. Now, I'm using good old-fashioned shellac. I'm just kind of putting it on. It's not really like a French polish, but I am putting on really thin coats. I'll probably put 6 or 8 coats of shellac on this. Now on the inside, I did have to use a brush to get into the corners. But I used my pad to kind of flow it out. The face is going to be held on with magnets. So the first 3 boards here you see are the frame that has the metal screws in it for the magnets to touch onto. The magnets are mounted on the face itself. Now here's that cross member that is going to keep the bow pushed out. And that's why I've got the spreader clamps on it. Now we'll put that into place. And release the clamps. Now I'll test fit the face into the cavity. And you can see now I can just reach in there and pop that face off when I need to change the battery in the clock. Now we'll get ready to mount this backing board on with a few nails. I debated how to hang the clock, so I ended up with using these little figure-8 tabletop fasteners. I spray painted them with some copper metallic paint, marking the back so I can drill those down into the back so it'll set flush. I've got the masking tape on there so I can mark it and see what I'm doing. So drill it down so they'll set flush with the back. I chisel out the neck. And then we should be good to go. Now to attach the hinges, I'm again using the masking tape on there so I can see what I'm doing. I've got these nice Brusso hinges. I'm marking the width of the hinge with the knife. I'll set the marking gauge to the thickness of the hinge and mark the depth that I need to cut to. And I just peel that tape off and I can have a nice visual aid of where the hinge is going to go. Now it's a matter of just chiseling that out. And I'll use my smaller router plane to get that down to the proper depth. A little back and forth until I get to the right depth. That looks about right. Now we'll transfer that to the door itself. I'm using a little spacer to set the door at where I want it. I'll put a temporary clamp on that, and then I'll bring over those mortises and mark the door where that hinge is. Then it's the same process to mortise in the hinge on the door side. Now we'll cut some glass for the door. Now I'm going to use this framing points to hold the glass in. I'd really like to use or get some antique glass, but I haven't been able to find what I want, and this is just kind of a temporary until I get that in. Now we'll attach the door, and she's almost ready.
Before I take the clock in and hang it up, I did want to point out a couple things. First of all, I'd like to talk about the face. I made this face with a laser tool. You wouldn't have to use a laser, obviously. You could hand paint it. You can purchase faces. You could use a Cricut machine to either make a stencil and then paint it, or you could use the Cricut to make the numbers themselves. You could cut it out with a scroll saw. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of different ways you could make the face. I did like the idea of showing the natural grain of the plywood. That wasn't my original intent. I was originally going to paint this, but I think this gives it a better arts and crafts feel. The other part I wanted to talk about was, you know, at the beginning, I mentioned that I had some pretty bowed lumber, and this cross member here, and there's another one behind it holding the face, are used to kind of hold those out straight. So when it bowed, I put the bow in, I pushed them out with that, and I think that's going to work fine to hold that in place. The top piece across here also had a bit of a bow to it. I had to cut this out of another board, and it's not as bowed, so I was able to glue that together. The glue probably would have been enough, but I did end up putting a couple screws in the top to kind of hold those together. Probably not needed, but a little bit of extra security there. The bottom board also has a little bit of a bow to it, but it is bowed in and it doesn't really show up much. And of course the door hides that as well. I didn't think it was enough to worry with, so it's in pretty good shape. Well, that was a fun and challenging project. Used some new technology and some old technology. My wife's pleased, and that's what counts. Thanks for stopping by.